Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show for a few days because I'm doing other things next week, but there's plenty of stuff coming when I get back. Anyway, I cannot tell you how many times I've stood on Omaha Beach and tried to explain the saga of the bombing on D-Day. Chuck Herrick returns to the channel to take us through the bombardment plan, last-minute issues and changes, and how it actually unfolded on June the 6th. And further details are in Chuck's blog via his book website, which is in the description below. So if today's presentation doesn't have enough detail, there's a three-part examination of it to go to an even greater level later on. But I'll bring Chuck in. Good afternoon. How are you today, sir?
Very well, very well. And then glad to be here and good to see you.
Indeed. And we were just talking about popular history and re-examining things. And the bombing of Omaha Beach, as I just said there, it's been something that if you're tackling June the 6th in any way or form, whether it's a blog or a book, you've got to mention the bombing. What was it about previous accounts or what you've examined before about the bombing on Omaha that kind of made you want to do this deeper dive? Was it like a scratch you couldn't itch or something? Did you feel there was something missing?
Well, as you know, I've been doing a series on Omaha Beach. I've done one on the duplex drive tanks. I've done one on the naval bombardment. And I'm really just kind of doing a forensic rundown of most of the main topics about where there were problems to find out exactly what happened. It's easy to say, yeah, they messed up the bombing, but there's always a why behind that. And most people don't dig into that very much. And that's kind of my background from the Inspector General Corps, is to go into those kind of details and trace it from the events up to the systemic problems.
And as we will get into it, it's the language, isn't it? I mean, you just said they're messed up, and it's often how an author or how a historian or how a report even frames the language can influence how something is discussed. You know, that something being an issue is different to someone being blamed for something, like someone screwed up and made is different to, and they had issues with. But we'll get into the detail as we go on. So folks, feel free to fire away with questions, but there's a lot of detail coming your way, both in today's presentation and I'll say in Chuck's more detailed examination on his website. But over to you, sir. So a fresh look at what went wrong.
All right, let me start off just to put things in perspective. Operation Neptune could not have succeeded without the air forces. Their support was essential, and not just on D-Day, but in the months leading up to June 6th, air operations set the conditions to make the invasion possible. Without them, the invasion could not have come off. Now, today, I'm focusing on a small part of that total effort, the part that failed, or a part that failed. But I don't want today's focus on this failure to cause anyone to lose sight of the larger contributions of the air campaign. Having said that, yeah, today's discussion focuses on a mission that did fail: the pre-8-hour bombardment of the coastal defenses in the Omaha assault area. Now, students of the Normandy landing should already know that this mission did not hit the beach defenses, and it hit far inland instead. And that's no surprise. What this discussion attempts to do is a bit of forensic investigation to try to figure out exactly what went wrong and why. And frankly, the answers are not what I expected. How it came about. General Eisenhower's major subordinate headquarters for control of the air effort was an organization named the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, and that was commanded by Air Chief Marshal Lee Mallory. On the 1st of April, it could boast a total of 5,667 aircraft of all types, which was an impressive force. Unfortunately, the AEAF was also facing a staggering number of tasks, so even that fleet of aircraft was insufficient. Now, one element the AEAF did not control was the Strategic Bomber Fleet, which included the U.S. 8th Air Force and the RAF Bomber Command. Based on the general need for unity of effort, if not unity of command, and the specific need for more combat aircraft, SHAPE moved to gain control of the strategic bombers for Operation Neptune. The heavy bomber community naturally felt that they could better contribute to the defeat of Germany by continuing their campaign against German industry, so they opposed this. The final decision made by the Combined Chiefs of Staff was that operational control, not command, operational control of the strategic bombers would pass to General Eisenhower on 14 April. One day later, on 15 April, the AEAF issued its joint air plan. As a result of this, the heavy bombers assumed responsibility for a large number of Neptune missions. One of those was bombardment of the invasion beaches on D-Day. And that's how those large, lumbering strategic bombers of the 8th Air Force came to be tasked to perform the tactical bombing mission at the invasion beaches. The 8th Air Force, commanded by General James Doolittle, had 1,350 B-17 and B-24 bombers organized into 225 squadrons, with 198 of those squadrons needed for the beach bombardment mission. This left it with 27 spare squadrons. The 2nd Bombardment Division, commanded by Major General James Hodges, had 75 squadrons of B-24 bombers, and he was assigned to cover the Omaha beach area. The 2nd Bombardment Division had 5 combat wings. Correction. Yeah, it had 5 combat wings, but one of them was the 95th, and it was just forming up, and it was too inexperienced for the mission. The 8th Air Force's 1st Bomb Division was responsible for Gold Beach and half of Juno Beach, and the 3rd Bombardment Division was responsible for Sword Beach and the other half of Juno Beach. Utah was tasked with the 9th Tactical Air Force, but the extra 27 squadrons of heavy bombers, they were on standby to take that mission if weather prevented the Tactical Air Force from hitting that target. Could you go to the next slide, please? Thanks. Initially, there would be 3 phases of air support at Omaha. The first phase involved 6 strikes against coastal artillery sites to the west of the landing beaches, including 2 strikes at Pointe du Hoc, 3 at the Mazy complex, and 1 at Gafos. Now, the one for Gafos, I have a couple question marks next to because I've seen different locations cited for that battery. But it was somewhere to the southwest of the Mazy complex. These strikes would be conducted by the RAF Bomber Command and by medium bombers and fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Air Force. The 3rd phase of air support included close air support and began after the troops were ashore and fighting. The 2nd phase, lasting from 0600 to 0625, was where the heavy bombers of the 2nd Bombardment Division came into play. This slide shows the final target selected in the planning phase. These varied a little bit from the Navy request. The Navy wanted, next slide, please. Thank you. The Navy wanted the radar installations at WN-74A, which is the resistance nest way up at the top left. They wanted that bombed, and they did not request bombardment at Port-en-Besson. The Air Force eventually accepted a target list, which very closely mirrored the Army's requests. Now, to explain that slide a little bit, the circles, of course, indicate each of the 13 places where there was a target. There are 5 of those that have a double circle on them. And getting ahead of myself a little bit, the larger 500-pound bombs were dedicated to where those double circles are. Now, largely speaking, those were all placed outside of the actual sectors where troops were going to land. And they were away from where the beach exits were. So the idea was they wouldn't mess up the beach exits, make them untrafficable. Now, there is one that you do see at WN-70 that is on a landing beach. And I assume that they allowed 500-pound bombs there because there was no beach exit there. Offshore, you see a dotted line, and that'll come into play a little bit later. That is roughly where the 1,000-yard standoff line would be, and that was a safety measure that will come into play later. Typically, each target would be hit by 6 squadrons, flying in 2 groups of 3 squadrons each, for a total of 36 aircraft for each target. Although the targets at Port-en-Besson had slightly fewer squadrons, with 4 and 5 being committed there. In total, this would be 75 squadrons and 450 bombers, give or take a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, the window for bombing was 0600 to 0625 hours, with the 2nd Bombardment Division's order stating that the absolute deadline would be H-2 or 0628. Next slide, please. Now, this slide's kind of busy, and I won't go into it in detail, and you don't have to just try to decipher all the details. But the point of it is to illustrate how the air targets were fully integrated with the various elements of the naval bombardment. Next slide, please. The heavy bomber force was not especially happy with performing tactical missions, as they were neither trained nor equipped for those missions. Beyond that, they cautioned that destroying hardened fortifications required pinpoint direct hits, which took many, many sorties to achieve. Fortunately, the beach bombardment mission did not require destruction of fortifications. The objective was merely neutralization instead, and that did not require pinpoint strikes on structures. On the other hand, the ground and naval commanders, they saw great potential in heavy bombers. At the risk of getting ahead of the story, it's worth getting an appreciation for the potential combat power of the heavy bombers. You see on this slide the standard bomb loads for any given aircraft that had been developed. So you see that we had 24 squadrons were equipped with the fragmentation bombs. Each aircraft would carry 52 100-pound fragmentation bombs. Now that's a bit of a misnomer because the fragmentation bomb actually consisted of 6 bomblets, each of them of 20 pounds. So one aircraft could carry about 324 of these bomblets. And those bomblets had a blast effect more or less equivalent to a 5-inch naval shell.
Wow.
So that's a very, very potent. I think the difference in bursting charge was 1/10 of a pound.
Gosh.
Yeah. Or they had 32 squadrons that were equipped with a 52 100-pound general purpose bombs on each aircraft. And finally, you had 19 squadrons with 12 500-pound bombs on each aircraft. Now, with 6 squadrons, 6 aircraft assigned to each target, the bomb tonnage substantially outweighed the shell tonnage that the naval bombardment could deliver. And let me explain this a little bit more clearly. If you could go to the next slide, please. This is a comparison of the air and the naval bombardment at the same area. We're talking about the D1 exit, and that included resistance nests 71, 72, and 73. Now, the Navy had assigned the USS Texas and the USS McCook to shell this. The Texas was only going to use its secondary battery, 5-inch guns. And the McCook, being a destroyer, its primary battery was 5-inch. Well, I see got a little bit of a movement there in my circle. But the point is that between those two ships, there are going to be about 550 rounds of 5-inch shells applied to the target. Now, that only comes to about 15 tons of munitions. Now, you could possibly include an additional 25 tons from the landing craft rockets. We had one concentration at this exit. But generally speaking, we're not talking about a whole lot of munitions there. It's tonnage-wise. Now, on the aerial bombardment side, the Air Force, or the 8th Air Force, had planned 2 target strikes there. So their strike package would be 72 aircraft, 36 of them carrying 52 of the 100-pound frag bombs, and 36 with 52 general purpose bombs. So, yeah, I apologize for the formatting being a little bit off. We got some transition in sizing.
No worries.
Yeah, but the bottom line is that tonnage delivered by the aerial bombardment theoretically was 205.6 tons, as opposed to 15 from the naval bombardment. So you can imagine if you were a ground or a naval commander, you would be just drooling at the thought of having that kind of firepower delivered on the target. Now, that, of course, as the bottom says, assumes you could deliver the bombs on target. Well, could you? Next slide, please, if you don't mind. One problem was that accuracy was a bit of a problem. And now, there were many ways to measure accuracy, most with more academic and theoretical usefulness than operational usefulness. The most practical measure was counting how many bombs dropped by a formation would land close to the target. Now, for evaluation purposes, a bomb landing with 1,000 feet of the aim point was desired. And within 2,000 feet was okay, but needed improvement. And anything beyond 2,000 feet was basically a wasted bomb and a failure. So to evaluate a drop, you would place these rings over your bomb pattern. The rings would actually be centered on the aim point, and then you'd merely just count the craters. And that way you would get a determination of how accurate you were. Now, this slide shows the accuracy of the 2nd Bombardment Division for 2 overlapping periods, beginning in November and leading up to just before D-Day. So as you can see, on average, only about 1/4 of the bombs that were dropped fell within 1,000 feet of the aim point. And only about 8 fell within 2,000 feet. Now, even then, the typical resistance nest was much smaller than a circle with a 1,000-foot radius. You know, 1,000-foot radius circle, that's 2,000 feet in diameter, which is almost 7 football fields in length and in depth. So that's quite a large area for your success measure. And yet, you still only had about 1/4 of the bombs you dropped there. So the theoretical value of air bombardment did not really reflect the reality. Can I go to the next slide, please? And that wasn't the only attritional factor when it came to bombing. There was also the matter of what they called non-effectives, which were sorties that took off but did not drop bombs for one reason or another. Now, this slide summarizes the 2nd Bombardment Division's non-effective rates for the months leading up to D-Day. The major factors, of course, were weather, which always plagued the 8th Air Force, mechanical problems, and to a lesser degree, non-mechanical other issues and some personnel issues. Now, what this slide shows is that over 1/3 of the sorties failed to drop bombs, almost 40%. Could you go to the next slide, please? Now, when you add these two factors together, suddenly the potential of the air bombardment is really reduced. By applying the 37.75% non-effective rate, and then applying the 25% rate of bombs falling within 1,000 feet, you end up with merely 32 tons of bombs likely to fall within 1,000 feet of the target. And that was a reality that I'm not quite sure the ground and the naval commanders appreciated. The Air Force, when they did their, when they protested against bombing the beaches, they didn't really talk about these accuracy issues. What they talked about was, well, I can't hit individual structures or knock out gun positions. So, like I said, I'm not quite sure that the air naval commanders realized that about 85% of the potential of the airstrikes was going to be either wasted or only partially effective. Could you go to the next slide, please?
Just a quick question for you, Chuck. In these assessments, did the 8th Air Force have any idea about what specifically they were trying to do to Avida Stonzes and Omaha? Because, you know, there are larger bunkers, there's maybe a trench network, there's barbed wire, there's supporting. Is there a sense of what it is they're trying to do to it, or they're just the first thing is hitting it first and assuming that any damage will do something?
That's a good question. Now, they never at any point made any indication or promise that they were just going to obliterate the place. There's a lot of talk later about your bombing was going to be so comprehensive you could just walk ashore. You know, that kind of stuff. They never advertised, promised, or inferred that that was going to happen, or implied that might be the results. They kept any comments pretty minor to the things such as blow away barbed wire, collapse some bunkers, etc. Not bunkers, pardon me, field works, trenches, things like that, but nothing major.
Okay, thank you.
Could you go to the next slide? Yeah, yep. We're on it. Yeah. Although Doolittle did not want the mission, he got with the AEAF staff, and together they worked very hard to find ways to make it work. He was a real can-do kind of guy with positive attitude, and he was going to do everything he could to make this succeed. Now, one of the first challenges they faced was determining the best bomb types to use, which we've touched on a little bit earlier. Since the mission was neutralization, not destruction, the emphasis was on smaller munitions, with 500-pound bombs being the largest used. And as we touched on earlier, those are limited to just a quarter of the bombers and in, quote, out-of-the-way kind of locations. Delayed fuses will also add to the potential for cratering. So delayed fuses were only used on those 500-pound bombs mentioned above, and on a few sorties, or correction, a few squadrons that carried 100-pound GP bombs that were also tucked into the formations carrying the 500-pound bombs. So the only delayed bomb fuses were on the on those, quote, out-of-the-way type targets. All the other 100-pound general purpose bombs and frag bombs had instantaneous fuses. Now, early on, Doolittle recognized that bad weather would be a problem. You can go on to the next slide if you like. Now, they did have at hand two navigational / bombing systems. One was the GEE-H, which used electronic beams for guidance, and the other was the relatively new H-2X. And I believe both of those originated in the RAF, and the U.S. Air Force adopted them and came out with slightly different models. Okay, so H-2X was a downward-looking radar. Now, to overly simplify, these were more effective in getting bombers to an objective than they were in providing precise bomber release data. Nevertheless, they were used for night bombing, and to a lesser degree, the 8th Air Force had begun trying to use them for daylight bombings. Again, though, with not a lot of precision. After some trials, it was determined the geography of the target area made the H-2X system the better choice. This was because the sharp differentiation between water and land provided an excellent return on the H-2X radar scopes. With all the targets located just above the high water line, H-2X could provide a good ranging data to feed the northern bomb sight. Now, it would be a jury-rigged progress, requiring periodic recalibration in flight with the bomb sight, but it worked just well enough. A crash program was begun in April to equip the aircraft, and the H-2X radar dome had to replace the ball turret, and to train the operators. Eventually, there were enough to provide one Pathfinder aircraft for every formation of 3 squadrons. On 26 May, Doolittle addressed the key air commanders at AEAF headquarters and announced that he'd been conducting tests on the continental coast about 100 miles north of the invasion beaches with several groups to determine the accuracy of using the H-2X. Now, according to Stephen Burke's book, The Deadly Failure of Allied Heavy Bombers on June 6th, Doolittle claimed an average error in range of about 1,200 feet and an average error in deflection of about 2,400 feet, which he concluded meant that they could bomb with an accuracy of about a half mile, excluding any gross errors. And that was actually comforting news considering what they were afraid they were going to be facing. A side effect of using H-2X was that it provided the sharpest image when the aircraft approached perpendicular to the beach. This ended up dictating the bomb runs to come in across the beach from offshore, rather than flying along the length of the beach. That decision has been questioned ever since. But in addition to this technical reason, there was a practical reason as well. A flight path parallel to the beach would require the entire string of 75 squadrons to fly in a single column, and with just a 1 minute or less interval between the squadrons, it would take longer to get them over the invasion beach than there's time in the bombardment window. So it just wasn't a practical approach. Next slide, please. The next problem to be tackled is one of assembly. It would have to be at night, and that wasn't something that the 8th Air Force really had much experience doing. They did daylight bombings, so that wasn't really something that played into their wheelhouse, as they say. But they settled down to try to figure out how to do it, and they got with the RAF's Bomber Command, learned a lot from the systems they used, and they eventually put together a plan using radio beacons, searchlights, flares, blind navigation routing, and several other things, and they came up with what they thought was a workable plan. Now, like I said, most of these techniques were not new. I believe the RAF routinely used many of them. but they were new to the 8th Air Force. So they put the plan to the test on 1 May during an actual combat mission, and they decided it was a success. Although that experiment used fewer than half the aircraft that would be in the air for D-Day. That exercise also took a look at what would be the best size for a squadron, best size to handle in those conditions. And the conclusion after testing several different squadron sizes is that they would use 6 aircraft in a squadron. Now, the normal formal organization of a squadron was, say, 18 aircraft. But for the discussion of today's topic, anytime I say the word squadron, we're talking about one of these little mini organizations of aircraft. If you go to the next slide, please. Now, there's been just a ton of confusion over what the actual formations were that were used. Now, what you see here is a fairly standard formation that included 3 of the 6 aircraft squadrons arranged in a lead, high right, and low left positions for a total of 18 bombers. Now, 2 of these groups, 36 bombers, would be assigned to each target, and they would typically fly at like a 1-minute interval. Now, this was a formation used during assembly, excuse me, and some combat wings intended that it was going to be used for the bombing as well, while other wings specified that all 6 squadrons change formation to fly and trail. Could you go to the next slide, please?
Yep.
So this is an example of the flying and trail formation. As you can see, this is the first group, 3 squadrons, 6 aircraft each, and the lead squadron had a Pathfinder with it. Now, there'd be another identical set of 3 squadrons following it, with a Pathfinder leading the 4th squadron as well. Now, in the event, the 2nd Bombardment Division's order stated that if you do have to do bomb through overcast technique using H2X, that all formations would slip into the trail formation. Now, that's a point of confusion because a lot of histories out there cite that they flew in squadrons abreast formation, and not really the case. I'll address an exception to that a little bit later on. I think you can go to the next slide at this point. The next matter to be tackled was the safety margin for the assault troops. The ground commanders wanted the bombers to strike as close to H-hour as possible to prevent Germans from recovering from any neutralization effect. The air commanders are naturally concerned about short drops hitting among the assault craft. That tended to be quite an argument, and it was only finally decided by Eisenhower himself. And his decision was that the last bomb should fall when the leading wave was no closer than 1,000 yards to the beach. Now, the air commanders warned that would still have about an 8% chance of bombs landing in and amongst the assault waves. The ground commanders, understanding the trade-off, they accepted that risk. Now, practically speaking, to assure a 1,000-yard margin, the last bombs would have to be released by H-5, which was the agreed-upon measure. And that's why the bombing window went from 0600 to 0625.
Right.
Now, subsequently, almost all the histories also add in that, hey, there'd also been a move to change that back to H-10. And that decision was made sometime before D-Day. And it was designed as an additional safety precaution. Now, sometimes that's presented as an additional safety precaution because of bombing through overcast. And sometimes it's presented as, no, it was just a general addition to the safety. The problem with that is that the H-10 figure never shows up in any of the actual orders anywhere. So that's kind of another one of those little historical facts that's crept in the record, and everybody has just kind of glommed onto it and agrees with it. On June 5th, the initial operations for launching the invasion were well underway. Troops were aboard their craft, the convoys were sailing. The 8th Air Force finally issued its operation order at 1350 hours, and the 2nd Bombardment Division issued its own field order at 15:25 hours. Now, those were the orders that set into motion the complex machinery necessary to get the 2nd Bomb Division's 75 squadrons into the air. Now, there soon followed a series of changes, what in the Army Air Force bureaucracy was termed annexes, but they're actually changes. And they changed information, they changed flight routes, they had additional information, they had explanatory information. So the 2nd Bomb Division issued no fewer than 5 of those changes. In addition to that, Hodges himself sent out 2 additional messages addressing some confusion over the navigational beacon data. Now, one of these changes was Annex 4, issued at 22:04 hours. And that was the first indication that things were beginning to go wrong. It directed all the bombers carrying 500-pound bombs to be diverted to the secondary targets. The secondary targets were 12 to 20 miles in. Now, no reason was given for this, though it was probably due to concerns about cratering. That decision, however, effectively removed 19 of the 75 squadrons from the attack on the beaches, even though only 4 of those squadrons were dropping adjacent to a landing beach. Now, this brings us to Plan B. Next slide. According to the 8th Air Force and histories, Plan B had been developed by the 8th Air Force in advance to cover the chance that the bomb through overcast technique with H2X was necessary. But that isn't really true. Plan B was actually a last-minute order cobbled together during the late hours of 5 June by the 8th Air Force staff. Little is known about how this came about, but Stephen Borquette located a July 1944 memo written by the 8th Air Force historian Thomas Parker. And Parker indicated that members of the staff had gotten cold feet about the adequacy of the safety zone, and they issued additional guidance in the form of Plan B. It was sent out without Doolittle's knowledge. He wasn't at the headquarters there. At 0200 hours on 6 June, just 2 hours before the first aircraft launched, and well after every crew had been briefed and had been dispersed out to their aircraft. Eisenhower, Lee Mallory, Montgomery, and Bradley were all unaware of this change, though Parker's memo claimed that they were briefed. Now, what did Plan B do? Well, one paragraph went back and addressed the 500-pound bomb issue, which the 2nd Division had already addressed or already solved. Plan B ordered all the fuses in the bombs be changed out and replaced by instantaneous fuses. But it still had the bombers attacking their original targets. So this would have countermanded the diversion to the secondary targets. And this is kind of confirmation that Plan B was not an existing contingency plan, because if it was, 2nd Bomb Division would have just put in instantaneous fuses from the beginning. The most important provision of Plan B dealt with the safety zone. Previously, there had been a simple cutoff time, as you mentioned earlier, 0625 hours. But Plan B included a new scheme, which you see at the bottom here, whereby the bomb release would be delayed by varying amounts based on whether the bombers or based on when the bombers arrived over the target. The practical result of this would be either bombs hitting too early and therefore not being of much use for neutralization, or if they arrived close to H hour, as the ground commanders desired, it would shift all the bombs too far inland to be any good. So one way or another, Plan B would essentially nullify the bombardment's usefulness. Could you go to the next slide, please? The question is, however, was Plan B ever put into effect? When it was issued, it included a line that a decision whether to execute Plan B or continue with Plan A, the original field order, would be made at 0100 hours. Now, normally copies of messages, operational messages, orders, things like this, are filed in multiple places. You're going to find them in the 8th Air Force's files because they were the sender. You're going to find them in the 2nd Bomb Division's files because they were the recipient. But there is no order or message indicating that any decision was made at 0100 hours. There's no indication that Plan B was put into effect, ordered into effect. And not only that, but there's no indication that Plan B or its provisions were passed down to the individual combat wings or that they passed them down to the individual bomb groups. Not only that, but none of the operational reports reflect any of the provisions of Plan B having been put into effect. The lead pilots didn't put that in there. The group reports didn't include that. The Pathfinder navigators and bombardiers didn't mention it. It's as if Plan B never existed beyond that one message. Now that's strange because, as we'll see later, that became a major focus in the histories later on. Now, next slide, if you don't mind, please. Despite that confusion in the final 2 hours, the mission was on. The lead aircraft of the 2nd Bomb Division took off a half hour early at 0150 hours, with the last of the 450 aircraft supposedly in the air by 0300 hours, 10 minutes late. But at least one of the combat wings reported that their last aircraft didn't take off till 3:41. So that's all too typical of this kind of reporting. There's lots of minor contradictions in some of these details. Now, once in the air, chaos soon ruled the night. Bombers climbed through initially layers of clouds, which disoriented and complicated things. Aircraft wandered off the precise blind navigation routes, and many pilots reported bombers suddenly flashing by at close distances. One formation of 18 aircraft had the horrifying experience of another similar formation flying directly at them on a reciprocal course, and the two sets of aircraft miraculously passed right through each other without a collision. In fact, there was only one collision that night, a slight mid-air collision, minor damage to both aircraft, and they were both able to continue their mission, which is just amazing. But assembly was chaos. It was difficult, and few units succeeded in gathering all of their aircraft. As a result, some formations left the assembly areas late, throwing other formations out of order. All the way to Normandy, formations were trying to wedge into the columns to get to their proper order, and individual lost bombers were trying to tuck into any formation they could find. In this process, 5 squadrons had to abort because their H-2X equipment failed, and a further 3 squadrons had to abort because they couldn't link up with Pathfinders. After all this, some semblance of order was achieved, though many formations did not fully assemble. About 0530 hours, the formations crossed the south coast of England. 13 streams of bombers on 13 separate courses were heading to 13 different targets. Given the weather conditions, they were supposed to have changed formation to be flying in columns of squadrons, with 6 squadrons flying in trail. 1 Pathfinder leading the 1st and the 4th squadrons, and the squadrons closed up to 30-second intervals or less. Now, before the 2nd Bomb Division arrived at Normandy, the Phase 1 attacks on the coast artillery sites had hit, with results ranging from excellent to not observed due to weather. Now, some of these strikes were quite substantial. The 2 RAF Bomber Command strikes had over 100 aircraft each. And I forget the exact numbers, but I believe one delivered about 600 tons of bombs and the other about 800 tons of bombs. So that was quite an effort. Unfortunately, the strike on Pont du Hoc, the last one, had been late, and their final bombs didn't hit until H+15. Now, fortunately, the Ranger assault there was also behind schedule, so we didn't have a fratricide incident. For the flight in, the B-24 squadrons had been assigned altitudes ranging from about 14,000 feet to 17,000 feet, with prescribed airspeed of 160 knots. The bomb runs were uneventful, even anticlimactic, at least in terms of enemy action. There was no flak and no fighters to speak of. None of the formations could see their targets. Only one report stated they could see the bomb flashes through the clouds, but they could not see the ground itself. Strike photos are useless, showing only cloud cover. Reports from pilots, navigators, and bombardiers are generally useless, as most could only state their assigned most would only state that they bombed their assigned targets, and most just mimicked the coordinates that were listed in the plans, since they couldn't see where they actually dropped the bombs and provide accurate data. The only exceptions tended to be with the aircraft carrying the 500-pound bombs, and their reports generally accurately show that they dropped them near the secondary targets around the St. Lo, the Cerisi Forest, and targets in that area. Now, there was an unintended consequence resulting in diverting the 500-pound bomb squadrons. Many of those squadrons included the Pathfinders for their formations. And when they diverted, they necessarily took with them the squadrons carrying the 100-pound bombs that were also in their formation. So the potential loss to the bombing effect was a little bit greater than just the 500-pound bombers. Now, of course, this would end up being moot due to the next point. And the next point is that no bombs landed on any of the primary targets. They all landed far inland. Now, for full disclosure, in some areas, there's claims that the bombs did hit in Port-en-Besson. And that was based on two things. One was an aerial photo taken a few days after D-Day, which appeared to show craters. And it was also based on reports from the villagers that some of their fellow citizens had been killed by the bombs. Now, after the invasion, the 8th Air Force sent in a survey team to take a look at where their bombs hit, and they couldn't find any of their bombs at Port-en-Besson. Now, I've looked at that overhead photo, and I'm no expert at this, but it looked more like the scattered shots of naval artillery fire as opposed to a tight bomb pattern.
It's interesting, chap, just to interrupt for a second. There was a whole lot of people interviewed in Vierville-sur-Mer, French civilians after war. But it's, from what I recall, they were interviewed in like a village hall or something. Mm-hmm. And they're all describing various hits coming in. And it seems, from my interpretation, that once the first person said bomb, as in from the air, everybody else said bomb, as in from the air. But in my reading of it, it sounds like a lot of them are talking about naval shells. But
I think so. What I haven't pointed out yet, and I probably should have, was that the naval bombardment was going on at the exact same time as the air bombardment. So it's kind of difficult to differentiate when you got bombers flying overhead and things landing and going boom in your garden. What was causing the boom? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there.
All good.
Oh, but anyhow, as a result, the bombers flew over, dropped into the clouds. Not much to notice there, nothing significant. They flew on for about 8 or 9 more minutes, turned right, flew out in the Atlantic, then turned north and went back to their base. Most of the bombers were back in their bases by 8:30 to 9:30 hours. And many crews volunteered for a second mission later that day so they could rack up another mission credit under milk run conditions. Now, that's a nice generic discussion of it, but what happened? What did the bombers actually do? Well, that's hard to determine from the operational reports, but both the 8th Air Force and the 2nd Bomb Division did issue their own individual reports in the operation, and they reveal some very interesting data. The 2nd Bomb Division summarized their attacks as seen here. Could you go to the next slide, if you don't mind, please? It claimed only 45 squadrons actually dropped bombs out of a total of 75. It gives no indication what happened to the other 30 squadrons, other than 5 had the malfunctioning H2X radar sets and the 3 squadrons that had no Pathfinder. But counting by squadrons is a bit misleading, a little bit too generic and broad brush. And the actual mission summary sheets show that about 352 aircraft dropped bombs, and meaning fewer than 100 failed to drop. And that's a very good percentage, as we've seen from the previous notes on the non-effective rate. So kudos in that respect. The 8th Air Force report gave slightly lower number of 329 bombers. More importantly, though, those reports also provided critical insight into Plan B. And you see on the right-hand column of that slide, it shows a list of times, and those are the times that they supposedly dropped their bombs. Now, according to the standard histories, the bombers missed the beaches, quote, intentionally in an abundance of caution in accordance with bomb release schedule in Plan B. But the 2nd Bomb Division's report shows that 32 of the 45 squadrons dropped their bombs early enough that no time delay would have been necessary, which meant more than 2/3 of the bombers should have dropped on or near the targets as much as the H-2X system would permit. 13 squadrons, the remaining 13, should have incurred only a 5-second delay, and that would be on about 450 yards. So if the Pathfinders had been following Plan B, then the vast bulk of their bombs should have hit on or very near the beaches, but they did not, which confirms that Plan B was never put into effect, and there must be another cause for the delayed drops. The 8th Air Force report addressed that point as well, but their table is very suspicious. For one thing, it showed all 75 squadrons actually dropping bombs, which is obviously incorrect. And it also stated that the squadrons, as they arrived, they came in 3 squadrons at a time at 3-minute intervals precisely. 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes, 3 minutes. And that's obviously somebody taking a hypothetical shot at collecting data. It wasn't wasn't reflected in any of the actual bomb reports. But having said all that, coincidentally, it shows a very similar distribution of timelines, of bomb times, with 2/3 of them coming in a period where it should not have displaced the bombs to the rear. Could you go to the next slide, please?
We had a comment about, is there any consideration of any squadrons or individual aircraft doing second runs?
There were orders specifically not to do second runs.
Right.
And the problem with the second runs is you had to turn north, get back north of the target.
Very dangerous place to be. Yeah.
Yes, and the anti-aircraft guidance for the fleet was anything going north you shoot at, anything going south is okay. There was one report that the H-2X radar hadn't been turned on, and they had to turn around and, quote, make a second run. Well, I'm not sure, and they didn't specify when they did that turnaround. I can't tell if it was turned around before they crossed the coast in England, which is by that time your H-2X should have been on, or not. But no, generally, not generally, there was a specific instructions not to do second passes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so why did the air crews collectively and uniformly drop too late? That's a difficult question. With Plan B ruled out, you have to turn to the various statements and the various orders that stressed accuracy and safety and even when to bomb. In short, there's a good deal of mixed messages, with emphasis on the need for accuracy on the one hand, yet strongly stressing that no short bombs could land near the assault ways. Another order emphasizing bombing as late in the window as possible also cautioned against short bombing. Well, pattern dispersal is its greatest in the direction of flight, resulting in both shorts and longs. And with all the emphasis to not bomb short, pathfinders would naturally delay their releases to ensure that any shorts would land well away from the assault beaches. Now, a second reason for caution, I believe, was that no one had much experience with the H-2X sites or systems, and therefore they lacked confidence in it. A third reason for caution was that this was the first time the crews had conducted tactical missions. In other words, dropping bombs anywhere near friendly troops. And I believe they were unsure of themselves under these conditions as well. In light of all this, I believe they were so cautious that delayed bomb releases were inevitable and common. Whatever the reason, the bombing behind the beach was not an intentional decision as directed by Plan B. There's no evidence it was ever put into effect, no evidence that any of the aircraft received instructions on that. It was simply a command-wide response to several factors, not the least of which included the many conflicting statements from the leadership. So how did the histories get all this so wrong? Well, that started with the 8th Air Force's November 1944 report, Tactical Operations in Support of Allied Landings in Normandy, 2 through 17 June 1944. It was written by a Colonel Walter S. Todd, who is the Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations in the 8th Air Force. Now, that document was 419 pages It comprehensively covered a wide variety of missions the 8th Air Force performed in that 16-day period. Many of those missions were highly successful, but the beach bombardment failure had come in for much, much criticism. So how then do you handle that portion of the report? Well, this is my take on it. You can state that you had a command-wide failure based on conflicting guidance that left the crews unsure and overly cautious. But that's not the kind of admission you like to put into a formal report, especially one directed to the Chief of Staff of the Army Air Force. Or you can simply take ownership of the matter, claiming it was unfortunate, but it was done intentionally for all the right reasons, an abundance of caution, and that it worked out best in the end. And you could trot out the unfortunate plan B and point to it and say, see, we planned on doing this all along. Finally, you'd redefine the mission objective, which they did, shifting focus from hitting the beach defenses to saying that disrupting the enemy rear areas was really their intention. And that's exactly what happened. Of course, all of this would eventually be contradicted by Doolittle, who said he'd never heard of that plan B. As contradicted by the flight crews and their many reports. And it was even contradicted by the 8th Air Force own statistics, as we saw earlier, which showed Plan B could not have been responsible for the delayed releases. It's also no surprise that none of the confusion that had arisen amongst the 8th Air Force staff that night would find its way into that report, because Colonel Todd, the author of that report, was also one of the 3 key players in that farce. So that report crafted a new version of events. The mythical H-10 delay decision first surfaced there, the decision that had no record of it in any of the orders. And the decision to refuse the 500-pound bombs was presented as if it had been made prior to D-Day as part of the deliberate planning, which, of course, it didn't come up until very late. It also arbitrarily changed the agreed-upon risk decision from a willingness to accept 8% risk to the 8th Air Force deciding that they would accept no risk. It established the story that the delayed bombing was a deliberate action done in accordance with Plan B, and finally it began the fiction that the misdirected bombs were somehow a vital contribution to the reduction of the beach defenses. Todd's account became the unquestioned version of events, and subsequent histories have embraced it. The immediate post-war official accounts were loath to pick at that particular scab, as the Army Air Force was lobbying hard to become an independent department. Could you go to the next slide, please? The first time it was addressed was in a pamphlet called Sunday Punch at Normandy, which was issue number 2 of the Army Air Force's Wings at War series. And it was a pure propaganda piece. Now, I'm going to read a passage from it, forgive me, but just to illustrate how wildly wrong the initial story made it into the public's eyes. Quote, if the decision to bomb ahead of our troops through overcast was breathtaking in its boldness, the results were epical. A short distance offshore lay the LSTs and other craft carrying the invading force. Confident of cooperation from planes they could not see, the men of the assault waves started ashore at the prescribed instant established. Exactly on schedule, the first wave of bombers came over, laying its bombs on the shoreline and proceeded inland. The entire force of bombers had to clear the attack point within 5 minutes or run the risk of dropping bombs on friendly forces. Absolutely according to plan, the heavy bombers performed their mission, laying their carpet of bombs before the attacking allies. So effective was their bombing, and with such minimum damage to friendly forces was the operation carried out, that many lives were saved. Ground commanders were lavish with their praise. Another milestone of modern warfare had been passed. So, that particular little function or fiction kind of was the first thing to make it out to the public. Now, by the time the more serious Air Force histories were being written, the 3 key 8th Air Force staff officers at the center of the events of 5 and 6 June and the Plan B incident had begun a series of command assignments to the Air University. And the historians of the new Air Force fell underneath the Air University. Now, did these three officers throughout this period, I think, what are we talking about a 15-year period? Did they influence how the histories would treat this operation? Was there undue influence to cover their roles or misrepresent events? Well, it seems likely, but there's no direct evidence of that. All that we know is that those official histories tell a much different story than do the plans and operational documents. Could you go to the next slide, please? So that's basically the conclusions of it. Plan B, never coordinated or approved, was never put into effect, and was not the cause of the bombing errors. The immediate cause of bombing errors was command emphasis on avoiding fratricide, excessive emphasis, lack of confidence in the H2X system, lack of confidence in selves, and lack of training. And I'll come back to that in a second. The bottom line, though, is more generic and more far-reaching. And that is that if you're going to assign a force trained and equipped for one mission, if you're going to assign it to a mission outside of its doctrinal role, that doesn't have the equipment, the training, the procedures, techniques, you need to provide that force plenty of time to be able to adjust to the new mission before you throw it in there. Now, that's a very profound sounding kind of comment. But the reality of Neptune in a wide variety of aspects was that despite being in the works for a couple of years, the last few months of the operation saw quite a bit of rushed effort. They did not have a time. So while it's easy to say they should have had more time to train, that simply was not the operational reality. So the bottom line is, yeah, that was probably the fundamental reason for the failure of the bombers at Omaha Beach. But you know what? They had to go with what they had.
Yeah.
That's the bottom line.
That last bit reminds me of that supposed theory that if you've only got to do one parachute jump, it's actually better to not go through the training in some ways, because you will lose. You know, if you put 2,000 people through a jump course, you will lose a certain percentage in accidents on the jump. But if they've only got to do the one and you actually just jump them out without any training, you won't actually lose as many as you would if you put them through the training. In that with the 8th Air Force, if they spend weeks working on this operation, which they're only going to have to do once, it's taken away, as you said right at the beginning, from their primary purpose, which is, you know, defeating the infrastructure of Germany. So although it seems bonkers that you don't give these guys a specialist training for something that is contrary to their doctrine, I can see why they didn't do it, bizarrely, you know.
Yeah, and I that brings up a point I'm sorry I did miss. One of the reasons they could not do much training was that they still had a full program of bombing.
Yeah, they've not been let off their other tasks, have they? Yeah.
No, and they were bombing submarine pens, E-boat bases, radar sites, airfields, bridges, on and on and on and on and on. So they did not have the luxury. Yeah.
And that's your last slide there. And then we've got quite a few questions for you, Chuck. I mean, amazing stuff. And as with the Robert Capa, fantastically delivered. But the questions, some of which you've covered, some of which we'll address anyway. Trent Telenko, RAF Bomber Command used oboe to strike Normandy targets. Where was oboe for 8th and 9th Air Force in Normandy? I mean, you didn't. That was one of the other navigation options. Was that ever considered for this in your research?
Not that I know of. The histories that go into this don't mention oboe.
Right.
Okay. And I don't know why. And thank you, Milbard. But I try to stay within my lanes of expertise. And I really don't know much about the Bomber Command and its techniques. So I'm going to wisely shut up and not make a fool of myself by saying something I don't know. All I can say is that the sources I had, which were in the U.S. Air Force, didn't really mention it.
Thank you. And then we've got various questions about previous bombing campaigns and whether or not there was any potential influence from them or lessons learned. So these examples of these questions are, so where are we? Gary said, didn't plan to study the Monte Cassino bombing in February, which did put a lot of bombs on target, but didn't achieve the purpose of degrading German defenses. And much earlier, where is it? Trentelenko has said, why were the 1944 Omaha Beach air bombardment so much less effective than 1943 Cape Gloucester and 1945 Borneo Beach air bombardments in the Southwest Pacific? Was it simply 5th Air Force flew lower? I mean, my answer before I hand that to you is there is a lot less cooperation between theaters and campaigns and air forces and armies than you would think. I mean, in the world we live today, where everything is online and social media immediately, lessons maybe be picked up really quickly. But in my experience hosting this, there isn't that much sharing of information between theaters and campaigns. Would that be your response as well, broadly?
Actually, there was a constant interchange of liaison officers between the theaters with information. And that was one of the problems in the broader context at Normandy, was there's a lot of complaint that you're not doing it like we do it in the Pacific.
Right.
So, of course, the Pacific, you had individual islands that you could basically isolate and bomb for a month, but you couldn't do that. And not to get too far off on that trail. But no, there was some interchange. There was also some resistance to how they did it in their area, because that's not how we did it in our area. There was that as well. But I think the biggest difference between the sources of the incidents cited in the Pacific were that they were not doing bomb through overcast.
Right. Yes.
Vector. Now, we didn't cover it here, but the 9th Air Force over at Utah, they got permission to fly lower than normal. So they came in under the undercast, and they were able to get, it still wasn't great bombing, but it still really rung the bell of the defenders at some of the positions there. And that's why theirs was relatively more successful. I hope that answered his question.
Yeah, thank you. A compliment from Bud here. He just said, Chuck is quite right to stress the normal 8th Air Force operational tempo. Operation secondary considerations also had to factor. There was a lot going on every day. Too easy to criticize 80 years later. Nobody meant to be stupid. I mean, and you said that right at the beginning. And I've stood there, and I several times I've been with families on the beach with 8th Air Force veterans who had flown over Omaha Beach. They've asked me to assess the 8th Air Force's bombing, and I don't really want to say, I kind of go, well, you did lots of things very well. And that day you were being tasked with something that was outside of your wheelhouse. And but I'm not going to lie to them and say it went perfectly, because it clearly didn't. But it was really weird being put on the spot. So having to confront a guy and say, yeah, wasn't your best day.
Let me touch on what he said about operational security for just a second, because that's another one of the topics that I didn't have time for today. If you had if you were with any of the Army troops, you were locked into one of the invasion camps, and you'd been briefed up as to what was going to happen. Yeah, days in advance. The Air Force couldn't do that because they were still flying missions. If they briefed up their crews in advance and those guys got shot down, that was kind of a security error.
Very good point.
So the vast majority of the people in the 8th Air Force and the 2nd Bomb Division in particular had no idea of what was happening until they were woken out of their bunks and they got in the briefing room, and the briefing room went to the beaches.
Yep. Thank you. We've talked about whether there was an influence before this, but Michael asked, anything learned from this that was taken ahead? Because Cobra, a month and a half later, has a bombing incident that doesn't go entirely to plan. Is there any direct correlation between that? I mean, it may be beyond what you've researched.
Well, that's kind of one of my down the road projects. So I don't want to say anything now that I haven't researched well enough. But going on the basis of the results prove the theory, I would say probably they didn't learn nearly as many lessons as they should have on both sides, the ground side and the air side. And I'll just leave it at that. That's an important point. Those two.
I mean,
tied together.
I agree. And when we've talked about, combined arms and air ground operations, it seems that a lot of the lessons learned in North Africa and Tunisia, maybe 2/3 of them were transferred to the Northwest Europe again, but like a third were left behind, and they had to kind of reinvent things they've already theoretically sorted out. But I think that's sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step reality of fighting a war.
When Doolittle had the Northwest Africa Strategic Air Force, he had, well, there were strategic bombers, but most of them were actually medium bombers. But at one phase of the Tunisian campaign, he had to give up his bombers to Cunningham, I think was the air commander. Where Cunningham used them for tactical operations. Now, what I don't know, and I haven't been able to figure out, was if Doolittle was actually involved in the planning for those missions and had learned any lessons from it and what he might have taken forward. I would hope he had. I've got no indication of it, and again, I don't want to speculate.
Okay, so we've got a couple of points about Plan B. I know you've talked about it extensively, but Lemonator said, why wasn't Plan B Plan A? And Andrew Findle said, could Plan B have been set as the default given the weather? I mean, was there an alternative scenario where, as I say, Plan B becomes what? Plan A?
Well, it's interesting. Plan A did not address bomb through overcast at all.
Right.
However, the 2nd Bombardment Division's operations order did address what to do if you had to do bomb through overcast. Now, the weather, at least 24 hours in advance, was predicting bad weather for the bombing. So if Plan B had been there in advance, and it had been the intended, more of a supplement than a replacement for Plan A, it should have been ordered and put into effect at, what was it, 13:25 hours?
Yeah. When
Plan A was put out. The fact that it wasn't tells me that there was no Plan B. But
Okay. And my last question, this is something I pondered for years living here in Normandy, is the 8th Air Force has its heavies, of course, but the 8th Air Force has its fighter bombers. It has other aircraft. People have in the sidebar mentioned, the use of mosquitoes. And when I'm still on Omaha Beach, I've often wondered to myself whether, instead of using the heavies, they could, whipped along the coast early at the same time with P-47s and try to get rockets in the opening of the embrasures or something like that. Was there ever any consideration about not using the heavies and using the fighter bombers or some other aspect, or borrowing some further 9th Air Force squadrons or something?
No, not that I've really seen. The tactical air forces were due to come in strongly on the Phase 3. In conjunction with the attack. But as far as the mission, at least in Omaha that I've studied, there's no mention of them at all. I think one of the defenders in the concrete Panzer supposedly said that his turret was strafed and it was punctured by a 20-millimeter shell. Totally unverified in other places. But I think they were seduced in general by the amount of potential tonnage that the heavies could produce. And that was probably a mistake, I guess you'd say.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my speculation is based on, Monday morning quarterbacking, and I've had the privilege of staying on Omaha Beach 1,500 times, or whatever it's been over the years. And me and my mates here in the pub, it's very, very simple in some ways. Say, don't do this, do that. Start the landing craft close to the beach. Don't do this. Make sure the bombard, bring that, and you've kind of cured it with a few strokes of the pen in 10 minutes. But the reality is, doing it afterwards, knowing what happened, is a hell of a lot easier than doing it in advance. As otherwise, wars wouldn't always take 6 years, would they? So, well, it's been brilliant talking to you. I mean, in this research, and again, I urge people to go and read the full 3 parts on Chuck's website. Is there anything about this that's still confused for you? Anything about this that you still wish you had an answer to?
That's kind of a tough question, and there's nothing that comes right to mind. If you press me, I guess I'd say I wish I had more complete mission reports.
Yeah. Because
they're kind of scattered. The one area that I have great questions on is Port-en-Besson. Now, that was the 500-pound bomb ones. And I've looked through the scanty mission reports that come from that. And they unfortunately just do the old basic thing is, yeah, I flew over the coast and bombed exactly where I was supposed to have.
Yeah.
But again, they were diverted.
Yeah.
So I don't have enough reports. At the opposite end of the beach, Lieutenant Colonel Broger was the leads of the commander of the 446th Squadron. They came in with 500-pound bombs. And he was very explicit in some of his more detailed reports. He filed several reports on thing, and he did state that, yes, I came in 6 squadrons in trail. We bombed at Saint-Lô. Now, one of his wing commander reports said, yeah, they bombed their primary targets, which was not true. So, yeah, I wish I had more clarification on Port-en-Besson, since there is some conflicting information there.
And the fact that there aren't the reports. I mean, if we're looking at the 8th Air Force outside of this, there are certain targets they're going back to repeatedly over several years. So, of course, it's in their interest to say, okay, what went wrong on this one? How can we improve it for next time? But with this, it all becomes irrelevant by June the 7th and 8th. You're not going to have to bomb those beaches again. Everything's going to be different. Yes, there's going to be bombing of some of the rail yards and some of the transport hubs, but the actual specific nature of knocking out a string of defenses along an arc of beach, it's gone. It's done. That's it. We're in Europe. So I guess once they'd filed enough reports to just fulfill the requirements of, well, we've analyzed it, there we are, the general is happy, there was no need to go back and analyze it and consider it. It's only us in the history field that would feel that we would need to have this. So what happened there? You know, and like I said, that I read reports from the French civilians that seem curious about whether they're talking about aerial bombardment, naval bombardment, or even ground fire coming from ground artillery. You know, as the Americans pushed inland, and I'm, you know, in what I'm doing on La Haye de Prix, and I'm trying to correlate all these civilian accounts of the bombardments from heavies, RAF. None of the timings match up. No, I've got these accounts by civilians saying that I think it's the evening of June the 6th. And I'm looking at it thinking, well, I think it's June the 7th, but the emotional truth of the account is one thing. The actual date the person said it happened is, you know, because in some cases these are civilians writing about it 60 years later. So yeah, they've got their June 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th muddled up. But yeah, it's fascinating that that something so discussed as June the 6th, Operation Overlord Neptune, there are still these gray areas within it. It's astonishing that there are still these murky bits where we still can't, pardon the pun, part the fog.
Now, going back to your civilians in Verville, to give the Air Force credit for what they claim, at least, they claim that their earliest bombs dropping were about 450 yards behind the coastline. Yeah. Now, if there's truth to that, yeah, if you're down the southern end of Verville, yeah, you might be getting hit by some. There's a aerial photo of a bomb pattern south of Point de la Perse.
Yep.
But it's more like 2,000 yards south of the target area. So not all of the bombs ended up back at Fontenoy or whatever that main city was. Where, I apologize, it slips my mind.
Formigny, I think you mean.
Yes, pardon me.
I mean, and that's the thing. I mean, these civilians, I remember this interview, is that some of them were living genuinely in houses along the D514, which is about 450, 500 yards of the beach. But others were on the roads inland that were 2 or 3 miles inland. And as I said earlier, it seems to me that once the first person said bombs, they all just said bombs, and that became the version. And I'm like, well, but I don't think they landed that far, you know. But anyway, it's fascinating stuff, and I'm sure we'll return to this subject in the future again. So folks, thank you for your support recently. We've had some fantastic viewing figures on the channel recently. Thanks for getting me over that 100,000 hurdle. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you everybody else this week. I'm scheduling shows all through August and September, some amazing ones coming up. Click like and subscribe. I will see you all next time. Thank you, Chuck. Thank you, viewers. Enjoy your weekend. Bye.
Thank you all.